Okay, so we're going to continue with the statistics unit. So this video is going to be talking about distributions and measures of central tendency. So this graph is a distribution. It's a histogram. It shows how the data is distributed. Histograms are used to look at continuous variables. The x-axis, which is this axis, represents the score that people got. Or the value. So like, let's say you were measuring depression. So these would be the various depression scores allowed with the scale you were using. You added up all the items, and really high numbers represented being really depressed, and low numbers represented not being depressed. So these are the scores. And let's use some other examples. So let's say you were looking at temperature. These would be the different degrees. Or let's say you were looking at height. These numbers would be the different heights. And then the y-axis, this part right here, is how many people got that score, or how many times that score happened. So if we were talking about the depression example, it looks like about 28 people got a score of around 100 or so. Whereas only about 5 people got a score of 120 or so. Anyways, so you get the idea. So that's a distribution. So distributions can look differently. They can have different shapes. These are the main shapes that distributions tend to take. You have the normal distribution, so that was kind of what we were just looking at. That's a pretty normal looking distribution. Then there are skewed distributions. This distribution and this distribution are both skewed, but this one is skewed positively, while this one is skewed negatively. So skewed distributions, they have tails. This is a tail right here, and this is a tail right here. So some variables are more likely to be normally distributed, while other variables are more likely to be skewed. So a variable that is likely to be skewed would be like anxiety. And then the last distribution shape that we're going to cover is the bimodal distribution. And that's when there are kind of two large peaks. They don't have to be exactly even, but more or less. So in looking at distributions, there are different ways to measure the center. Measuring the center is just a way for us to understand what the data looks like. And there are various ways to do it. You can use the mean, median, or mode. So if we're looking at the mean, this is sometimes called an average score. This statistic is represented by X bar. So that's what people use to symbolize the mean, is X bar when they're talking about means. It means for the sample, that is. So the mean is the sum of all the scores and then divided by the number of scores. So if we look at here, we have 4 scores. We added them up, and then we divided them by 4, which was the number of scores. If there were 5 scores, we would have divided it by 5. And that gave us 4.25. So the mean of these scores was 4.25. Then there is the median. It is the score that divides the sample in half. So when figuring out the median, you want to order the scores from lowest to highest, and then count from both sides of the distribution until you get to the center. if there's an odd number of scores, the median is the middle score. But if there's an even number of scores, the median is the average between the two middle scores. So if we look at this example, we count from both ends until we get to the middle. So we get rid of both sides, and that leaves us with 5 as being the center. But let's say that there was a 10 right here. Then it's an even number of scores. So then we follow this rule. We average the two middle scores. So if there was a 10 right here, that would mean that 5 and 6 would be the two middle scores. So you would add them together, then divide by 2, which would give us 5.5. So that would be the median score. Then the third way of measuring the middle is the mode. Now, the mode is the most frequently occurring score. That's why, if we look at back here, why they call this bimodal, because there were two places where the most frequently occurring score happened. So if we look at these numbers, we want to figure out which number occurs most frequently. And it would be 5, because there are two 5s. But the rest of the numbers, there's only one of. So when we decide which measure of central tendency we want to use, we have to keep in mind the distribution. Researchers consider certain measures of central tendency better for certain shapes of distributions. So let's look at what that looks like. So if we look here, the mean is 1.3, while the median is 0, and the mode is 0. So when distributions are skewed, the mean gets pulled towards the tail. So it gets pulled towards the tail. So in these cases, researchers consider the median and the mode to be better measures of central tendency than the mean, because the mean gets so influenced by that tail. But most of the data, most of the data happens right here. And so that's why we are more likely to use the mean or the mode, because they're less influenced by these skewed results. That's the end.